Welcome to another edition of Turn 6 Garage. Today we are looking at this, a 2003 Mitsubishi Outlander. And I'm going to explain to you why, for under $7,500, one of these CU Outlanders is actually not a bad buy if you're looking for a small or mid-sized SUV. So let's start with this car. It's a 2003 XLS powered by a 2.4 4G64 Sirius engine with a 4-speed automatic transmission. It's got 235,000 kilometers, and all we want for this car is $6,000. So this is one of the cheaper Outlanders with a roadworthy certificate, but this Outlander is one of the highest specified cars of the period. It is in XLS trim. Launched in Japan as the Airtrek in 2001 and as the Outlander in the US and everywhere else in 2002, the Outlander replaced the Pajero IO as a much bigger mid-size SUV for Mitsubishi. Built between July 2002 and October 2006, the CU Series Outlander was a good seller for Mitsubishi. The Airtrek lasted between 01 and 08, but Mitsubishi around the world sold quite a few Outlanders. It had proven that this small mid-size SUV was working, and this idea really helped them out of their financial troubles. Mitsubishi was somewhat late to the party with the mid-size SUV. Their Pajero IO offering was just too small, so they aimed the Outlander to be bigger, better built, and better backed. 5-year, 130,000 kilometre warranty in Australia to try and steal sales from the established competition, which they did quite well during 2003 and 2006. One of the first things to look for is the paint. Now, the paint on these cars, particularly the early cars, isn't brilliant. As you can see here, we have some clear coat peel on the bonnet, which we've touched up. We've also got some clear coat peel on the guard and some clear coat peel on the fuel filler cap. The paintwork on these cars wasn't brilliant, particularly 2003 and 2004 model year cars. And another critical thing to mention here is 2003 and 2004 model year cars are powered by a 4G64 engine, whereas 05, 06, 07 are powered by a 4G69 engine. When you're buying one of these things, make sure you check the parts off correctly. 03 and 04 model year cars, which for a company that was financially not in a good place, have different parts to some of the 05, 06, 07 cars. And that includes engine parts, exhaust parts, suspension parts, steering parts, brake parts. They're not exactly the same, which is a bit of a surprise considering how Mitsubishi made the Sirius engine for 36 years and in that period of time took a Lancer platform and made an SUV out of it. But it doesn't share parts with the Lancer. Yes, it shares the same platform, but all the parts aren't exactly the same. Something you need to consider when you look at one of these things, always check the parts you buy, because they may not always be the same if it's a generic part. What else to look for? Well, suspension wear, particularly on the rear end. We had issues with suspension on this car where we had to deal with the wishbone bushes, had to deal with the rear control arms, rear sway bar links, front control arms, front sway bar links, although this car was a particularly neglected example when we bought it. And something major you need to look at with 03 and 04 model year cars, the exhaust. They commonly have issues there, and this one had those issues. A corroded muffler meant this car A, stank when we bought it, and B, made a very fruity sound to it. Also something to consider with 03 and 04 cars, the lights. These ones are cracked, and finding a set of 03, 04 lights, because they have a black backing on them, heads later cars which are thinner, clear backing on them, is very hard. So we're going to be fixing up another set of lights in better shape, but this is a common issue with these cars. The cracked headlights here, well, it's not the only one of its period to have them. Other things to look for, well, seals and interior wear. These are not bad, but if they are neglected like this one was, then it does have a bit of an issue. You do have to deal with them. We did deal with them, but there was a lot of things that needed to be done with this specific car. And that's the other thing, like the Nissan Micra that I was reviewing earlier, it's not the car so much as the people who drive them. Outlanders tended to be bought by those originally as family cars bought on a lease, sold after 5 or 6 years, and they found their hands into the loser market, basically. People who treat cars badly, buy them and can't afford the repairs. And on these cars, if you don't repair them and don't maintain them, well, they're not going to wear it up and stand up too well. I think that was the case with this one. Gut instinct from the books and the information I have of the car was it was a 2 or possibly 3 owner car, and the final owner maintained it very poorly, let the car go 25,000k service intervals. They didn't do the suspension, the tyres when we bought it had a lip, and when they let the exhaust go, they just barely drove the car at all. They just left it under a tree and all the seals perished. So that's something you have to consider when you're buying an Outlander. Has this car been maintained? Or has someone spent the money to maintain it? Or are you buying it with that price in mind to spend the money to maintain it? Something you have to consider when you're looking at one of these Outlanders.
In terms of engines, you had Mitsubishi's tried and tested Sirius engine in 2.4 litre guise, but they're 2 variants, the 4G64 engine from 2003-2004 and the 4G69 engine covering the 05 to 07 model years, although this came in mid-2004. Both made it to a 4-speed automatic transmission with the Invex 2 system. No manual options were available in this generation of Outlander in Australia. The Sirius engine is an interference engine, so if you don't change the timing belt, the engine blows up. And unfortunately, quite a few of these cars have had that happen. So if you get one of these and there's no proof of the timing belt being done properly, i.e. a receipt to prove the date and time of the timing belt being completed, I'd say do the timing belt, because if you don't, it's a blown engine, and that basically at this end totals the car. So it's worth doing the timing belt as soon as you get the car if you are unsure in any way, shape or form of your car. Now in this one, the timing belt has already been done. We've had that done. So for the next owner, it's no worries on that front. But again, like I said, you really need to check this because this is quite a serious thing with this car.
So what's the Outlander like on the inside? Well, if you're 6 foot, like me, and you have an XLS model, the headroom is a little pokey. The seats are a little bit, how do I say, firmly placed, because they're a bit snug on someone like me, because the seat adjustment is either you're lying back really far or you're sitting up hunched over the wheel. Now, I'm not the target audience for this car, to be fair. Mitsubishi said they're aiming this car squarely at younger women, and they've designed it in terms of ergonomics for somebody of that size, someone a bit smaller, smaller feet, smaller hands, and for those sort of people it would probably be a good car. Now in this XLS model, you got a factory sunroof, you got a 6-stacker CD, you got air conditioning, you got 4 airbags, so driver and passenger, and 2 in the sides of the seat. You also had different gauges to the standard LS model, and you also got the alloy wheels, clear coloured lights, which all brake. In terms of driving position, if you're someone of my size, it's really bad. The pedals aren't so bad, amazingly enough. It also has a foot-mounted park brake that feels like it's made out of chocolate. It feels very, very flimsy, although it hasn't broken, thank goodness. Controls are relatively easy to hand. I do like the design of this interior. I do like the clock in the centre. I do like centre air vents. It is a very good design, I think. But it does feel a bit pokey if you're someone of my size. But then again, I wasn't target market for this car. Storage is also really good in this interior. You have good glove box here, have decent storage compartment here. We also have really good storage here. This is the center console, and you have the part that goes back, which gives you a very large center console. You also have a small little storage here for something thin. Also, what would be a good drinks tray. So it was made in mind for storage. It's actually quite good in terms of interior storage. But it's not my favourite place in the world to sit in, but if you're after a car like this, it's not a bad place to be. What is a bit disappointing is the boot. It's not particularly big. It is a lot bigger when you fold the seats down, but I mean, come on, it's not that much bigger than a Lancer. If anything, the Lancer wagon has more space with the seats up than this thing does with the seats up. Now obviously with the seats down, and get one touch operation, you'll get more space obviously if you fold the headrests away. It does have a lot of space when you fold the seats down, but with the seats up, it doesn't have as much space as you would think. It's certainly got less space than the equivalent Magna of the same vintage. And the Magna wasn't that much more than this. The LS Magna wasn't much more, and the ES was actually cheaper than the XLS Outlander. So it didn't really have a lot more in the way of space. It was more a case of different style of car build, different style of buyer. But for what a car that's meant to be carrying a family, I kind of wish it had a bit more space at the back. Something that is almost laughable at the state Mitsubishi's finances were in 2003 or in the early 2000s and late 90s is the fact that a car of this size has drum rear brakes. I mean, come on, it's an SUV, you're putting children in it, and you put drum brakes on the back of this? Kind of tells you a lot about the people that were designing this car, what kind of budget they originally had. Maybe there was a reason why there were so many changes between 2004 and 2005 model year Outlanders. Maybe they got a sudden cash injection to make the car better, because these early cars show that there really wasn't a lot in the cupboard when they were designing the car. They were designing it on a shoestring. Although, for what they've done, the car might not be so bad, but you get the sense with the Outlander that the finances of the company that built it really weren't there. And this is one of the things that you see with the Outlander. There are other things too, but you notice them behind the wheel. Where the Outlander has its biggest shortcomings is behind the wheel. Dynamically, this car isn't brilliant. It just feels awkward to drive. Feels like there's understeer. Even with good tyres I fitted to it, I fitted Michelin Energy XM2s to this car, and it still likes to understeer. It doesn't like off-camber corners. It's okay in a straight line. 4-speed gearbox would prefer if I had another ratio, but it's not bad. And it has a sports mode auto as well, which is really good, so you can change your gears manually, which is always a plus. But in terms of the driving experience, which probably isn't going to matter to SUV buyers, put it on the record, it's not brilliant. The equivalent Lancer and the equivalent Magna do drive better than this thing. But for most people buying these cars, it's not really high on their priority list. So I guess if you're buying an Outlander, don't expect to enjoy the driving experience, because you probably won't. And there were no manuals offered for this period, which was kind of sad. I kind of wish there was. But you get the sense, as I mentioned with the drum brakes, this car, in terms of the way it drives, you can tell that the people who were designing it were designing it on a shoestring. One place they didn't skimp though was the styling. They used Olivier Boisson, who worked at Mercedes-Benz when Mitsubishi had been bought into by Chrysler or Daimler Chrysler, and Olivier Boisson did a very, very good job with the styling. So you can tell people that your 20-year-old Mitsubishi was designed by the same person who used to design Mercedes-Benzes, which is always a plus to have. That's why it looks so good even now. I think it's the best looking Outlander of the lot in terms of appearance externally. But I do think if you're after an SUV that looks really good, it's not a bad car. If you want an SUV that's cheap and reliable, as long as you maintain it, this is a good car. But I do believe that if you don't maintain an Outlander, if you buy it and don't think you're going to have the money to maintain it, might I suggest go look for a Toyota or a Honda. These things, if you don't maintain them, are going to bite you. And if you haven't got a lot of money, that's not a good thing.
So if you're looking to buy a 2003-2006 ZE, ZF/CU Outlander, where would you be looking at? Well, in terms of pricing, there are a lot of clunkers around the 2, 3, 4 grand mark with issues. To get a sorted car, you need at least $5,000. This is something with about 270, 280 on the clock with registration and a roadworthy certificate if you're in Victoria. The car you're looking at here is around $6,500, 235,000 Ks on the clock, 6 months registration, new tyres, new timing belt, new water pump, replacement exhaust, and also replacement brakes. We've done a fair bit on this car to bring it up to snuff because this car, as I said when we got it, wasn't very good and needed a fair bit of work. So this car's priced mid-tier in the Outlander, so 6 to 6.5. You've got cars with this sort of mileage between 03 and 06. Mostly you're looking at 03, 04 XLSs and LSs in 04 to 06 cars. Similar mileage. Again, prices dependent on registration and location. On the higher end of the scale, you've got the $7,000 to $9,000 cars, which are the very low mileage examples. You've got the newer trimmed cars, so you've got the Actives, the VRs, and the VRX trimmed cars with lower Ks on them. Again, these aren't bad buys, considering that they're relatively old cars, but they're relatively simple as well. So you can get these things for quite a decent amount of money. Again, you need to consider the car in terms of history, mileage, and also the mechanical state of the car. So you can go all the way to 10 grand for an Outlander, but it is getting to a part in that area where there are newer cars that are better than the Outlander. I would say stick below 7.5 grand. Look for something with good history, look for something that's in decent shape, and that probably would work best for the Outlander. Although, to be fair, the newer Outlanders with their CVT seem to be more troublesome as time progresses. That might explain why these older cars in really good shape start going for more, because they're less likely to be troublesome than the new one with a CVT. CVT replacement is $5,000, whereas if it has a transmission issue, it's around $1,500 to $2 grand to sort it out on the old car. Bottom line is, should you buy an Outlander of this vintage? If you want a cheap family car that's reasonably sized, that's reasonably economical, that's reasonably cheap to run, that's easy to find parts for, then it's a good car to buy. If you just want a cheap little runaround SUV for the family, it's a good car to buy.